At a table crowded with candles and laughter, Patrick Rice watched Kayla stand up and speak the words that would unmake his life. It was 12 November 2024, a warm autumn evening, the kind of night families remember for the wrong reasons. His in-laws' vow renewal, 23 people clustered inside a private room, glasses raised, cameras out. Kayla's voice cut through the chatter with unnerving calm. "I'm pregnant," she said. Then louder, with a certainty that felt like a verdict. "Patrick is the father." Silence arrived like a physical thing. Conversation stuttered and died. Plates of food were forgotten. Angelina, Patrick's wife, went still, her face flushing a color Patrick had never seen on her. For a heartbeat, Patrick thought it was a grotesque joke, then watched as disbelief hardened into something harsher, rage. People around the table whispered, then murmured, then stared. Some reached for their phones. The room smelled suddenly of perfume and cheap cologne and the metallic tang of panic. Everything changed in an instant. If that line feels like an exaggeration, it isn't. In the hours that followed, private messages piled up, social feeds overloaded with screenshots, and family chat groups splintered. Angelina unfriended and blocked him. Within 24 hours, the locks on the house had been changed, and a note left, an instruction not to return. Patrick was put on immediate administrative leave from his job at the tech firm where Gerald Thompson was his boss. His colleagues stopped replying to messages. Neighbors pretended not to see him standing at the curb, his bag at his feet, bewildered and alone. He slept that first night in a motel off the motorway, the television on low to keep the silence from filling his head. The mattress dip and fluorescent light were small concessions to a life he had expected to be ordinary. 2 careers, a mortgage they had pushed aside, a plan to start trying for children in the spring. He had not imagined being publicly accused of fathering a child with his wife's sister at a family celebration. This is not a story told in a moment. It is a series of moments strung together by the stubborn facts that survive when everyone else has chosen sides. The accusation was public, the consequences were immediate, the path back would demand evidence, patience, and a kind of clinical thinking that Patrick had never needed until that night. If you want more stories that peel back how private life becomes public and how evidence can save someone, subscribe now. There's a twist ahead. Patrick's life up to that night looked ordinary on the surface. He worked in product operations at a mid-sized tech company. He managed client relationships and logistics, reported to Gerald Thompson, and had a reputation among coworkers for being conscientious and precise. Angelina taught at a local college. She was known within the family as the reliable one, the person who kept lists and pristine guest rooms.
They had bought a house together in a roughly priced suburb last year, stretched the budget but excited about the yard for future kids. Friends described them as steady, perhaps a little too cautious, comfortable in routines. Kayla, Angelina's younger sister, was harder to pin down in people's recollections. She'd been through a handful of public breakups, a move across the country and back, some short-lived jobs that never seemed to stick. To those who loved her, she was also charming and impulsive. To others, she was someone who made headlines at Thanksgiving and left them behind. The family had tolerated her volatility, the way families sometimes allow a member unpredictable leeway, until tolerance runs out or until the unpredictable causes a scandal. So when the vow renewal dinner was posed as a joyful family gathering, everyone assumed it would be one of those evenings you later tell as a fond anecdote. They had no way of knowing the scene Kayla intended would refract back on each person in the room and leave their private histories fractured in the public light. Patrick replayed the dinner in his head 100 times in the small hours. He could still see the exact way Kayla folded her hands, the tightness at the corner of Angelina's mouth, the fork that fell off the plate and clattered to the floor. He remembered a cousin whispering, "Is she serious?" and the audible intake of breath when Kayla named him. He remembered the stunned weight of 23 witnesses at the table, witnesses who hours later would text and call, some to express shock, others to press for explanation. His phone filled with messages he could not answer. What people felt at that table mattered less in practical terms than what they did next. Within hours, Angelina had stormed out of the house they shared, with Kayla's accusation echoing behind her. Locks were changed. Their shared accounts were separated. His employer placed him on leave, ostensibly to investigate the personal matter and its workplace implications. The house he had signed mortgage papers for, that he had imagined filling with poise and the small chaos of family life, was closed to him. Patrick's first instinct, in the immediate blur, was that this was madness that would crumble under its own internal contradictions. He knew his travel schedule for the months prior. He knew with the same certainty people in his line of work know their calendars, bookings, flight numbers, hotel confirmations. He had receipts and photos,
timestamps, and boardings. It took one small fact to pierce the panic and give him an axis on which to pivot. He had been away for work at the time Kayla claimed the conception had occurred. Memory and paper diverge in a crisis. Memory is elastic, receipts are not. The receipts were precise. He dug through email on the motel bed, the glow of the screen a harsh private light.
A ticket confirmation from his company travel portal showed a flight to Seattle departing on 14 September and returning on 17 September. The hotel reservation landed squarely within those dates. He had a photograph, a silly one, taken outside a conference center on the afternoon of 15 September. His colleague in the corner of the frame, a lanyard around his neck, the timestamp embedded in the file. The boarding passes on his phone matched the corporate expense report he'd filed 3 days later. The dates were incontestable. According to records, he was not in town during the window Kayla claimed. If you have ever been on the wrong end of a public accusation, you will recognize the way relief from one fact steels you for the work ahead. The receipts do not apologize for the harm caused. They are only a beginning. But for Patrick, that beginning was everything. It gave him leverage against the chaos of the night. It let him begin to think not as a man under siege, but as an investigator. He began to collect more than his own evidence. He photocopied and screenshotted everything he could, the flight manifests, the hotel folios bearing his name, and a credit card number at the bottom that matched his, the time-stamped picture. He made secure copies of emails and sent them to a personal account. He learned, in the rawest way, why people told him for years to keep backups and maintain records. Reputations are defended by files and timestamps, not by good intentions. That pivot from stunned victim to methodical collector set the tone for what came next. If the accusation had been a sudden lightning strike, those receipts were the long, steady ladder that could pull him out of the storm. Patrick's next step was practical and obvious. He reached for the one thing most couples share and often take for granted, the family phone plan. If he had been wrongfully accused, perhaps the phones would tell a different story than the dinner table. He already suspected that some part of the family's communication would hold a memory Kayla or Angelina might have preferred to keep private. In modern life, your maps, your call logs, and your photos form an involuntary ledger. They remember what you tell them to forget. What Patrick found in the phone records was not a smoking gun at first glance. It was pattern. Pings and call logs indicated repeated contact between Kayla and a local number of a man named Derek Morrison. The number, when he ran a reverse lookup, resolved to a name associated with the business card he had glimpsed at a family barbecue months earlier. Derek Morrison, who, according to social profiles and workplace directories Patrick could piece together, was Angelina's boss. It is worth pausing here to explain what was in those records and why they matter. A phone carrier's billing record, sometimes called a CDR or call detail record, will show which numbers called or texted, the timestamps, and often the cell towers used during the connection.
It does not, by itself, reveal the content of conversations, but pattern matters. Frequent late-night contact, brief calls at times when a woman in the family might claim to have been alone, or co-located tower pings that put two devices in the same place at the same time can form a narrative when overlaid with other evidence. Reverse lookups and directory searches can connect numbers to names. Metadata, as investigators call it, is the scaffolding around which a timeline is built. In Patrick's case, the metadata suggested a relationship between Kayla and Derek that did not fit the story Kayla told at the dinner table. The pattern of calls and the timing, often late, often clustered around weeks before the claimed conception window, were red flags to a man trying to make sense of a sudden accusation against him. He had no motive to accept this as coincidence. There is a legal threshold to accessing certain kinds of records. Patrick did not pretend to be a lawman. He knew that pulling phone data without consent had limits, that subpoenas could force carriers to produce records for litigation, but that the process required a lawyer. Which is why, when the record trail began to point away from him and towards someone named Derek Morrison, he stopped trying to do everything himself. He reached out to a lawyer he had worked with on small matters before, Patricia Winters, a civil attorney known in local circles for taking complex personal claims and turning them into manageable legal strategies. Patricia understood two things almost immediately. One, Patrick had a solid alibi for the alleged conception dates, Seattle 14 to 17 September. Two, any challenge would be fought on two fronts simultaneously, narrative and paperwork. Narrative because the accusation had gone public and would shape reputations. Paperwork because to reverse an accusation, you must assemble the documents that prove the world wrong.
Patricia's first move was conservative but decisive. She advised Patrick to preserve everything, phones, laptops, documents, and to refrain from direct contact with family members who had blocked him. She explained, in language that was blunt and plain, that the next stage required formal legal tools. A subpoena, she said, could compel phone carriers and medical providers to hand over records. A subpoena is a court order, simple as that in meaning, complicated as that in obtaining. It obliges a person or company to produce documents or testify under oath. It is not a magic wand, but it can make companies that hold data turn over material that is otherwise private. At Patricia's suggestion, Patrick also contacted a private investigator, Raymond Toll, a former LAPD detective whose transition to the private side had given him a reputation for meticulous forensics and a quiet, probing manner. Raymond listened to Patrick's account like a man assembling a jigsaw puzzle.
He asked about dates, receipts, contacts, social posts, CCTV near the house, delivery logs, anything with a timestamp that could be cross-referenced. He spoke in practiced, economical phrases. "Start with what is indisputable," he said. "Work forward from there." Raymond took a methodical approach. He pulled publicly available social media posts and cached versions of pages that might have been deleted. He checked traffic cameras in the neighborhood for overnight periods and made a list of local businesses that might have CCTV footage from late-night deliveries or visitors. He ran the license plate of a car seen parked in Patrick's driveway in a grainy neighborhood footage recovered by a neighbor's Ring camera. That plate, Raymond told Patrick quietly when he had traced it, resolved to a vehicle registered to Derek Morrison. At each step, Patrick felt a mixture of vindication and unease. Vindication because the evidence was beginning to line up away from him and towards other actors. Unease because the more he learned, the more complex the story became. There were personal betrayals hinted at by the call logs between Angelina and Kayla, financial transactions that suggested coordination, and a social media footprint for Derek that was thin and carefully curated. None of this proved criminality, none of it let Patrick declare victory, but it allowed him to stop being passive. Before any formal filings, however, the immediate personal cost kept accruing. Friends took sides. Family members who had been loyal suddenly demanded explanations Patrick could not give without revealing documents he had not yet subpoenaed. Patrick found that the legal process itself was a form of exposure. To pursue the facts meant to broaden the circle of how many people would see his life, his receipts, his private messages. The irony was bitter. He sought privacy to defend himself, yet the only way to restore his reputation was to make the private public in a controlled, evidentiary way. There were nights when the personal felt unbearable. He would wake at 3 in the morning and find himself scrolling maps on his phone to confirm the precise route his company car had taken on a certain September evening. He replayed conversations with Angelina, some tender, some routine, with an intensity that made him wonder how much of their marriage had been built on assumptions neither had interrogated. He thought of Kayla, too, and how her voice at that table carried not only accusation, but a public desperation. He did not like the shape of it. It felt like a family quietly ripping itself open. When the first batch of documents came back, they confirmed what he had hoped: flight records showing his departure and return in mid-September, hotel receipts matching his credit card charges, a time-stamped photograph at a conference center that could not be faked without forensic artifacts. These are the kinds of details investigators love because they are quantifiable, mechanically recorded facts that refuse to bend to narrative pressure. They do not lie, they only show what the devices recorded. The phone metadata suggested that Kayla had been in repeated contact with Derek Morrison during the months that precede September. Pattern, remember, not content. If you read the logs strictly, you see numbers and timestamps. You see devices pinging towers, but you cannot read tone or intent. That is why multiple streams of evidence are necessary. A call record aligned with a credit card charge, a GPS ping aligned with a parking lot camera, a social post aligned with a hotel folio. Each cross-confirmation tightens the net. Patrick had to learn the language of this work quickly. Raymond explained what a reverse lookup did. It took a number and searched public registries and databases to find which name it had been associated with, and sometimes which business. Patricia explained the difference between a motion and a subpoena, and how a motion to freeze assets could be employed to prevent dissipation of funds, an important preventive measure when reckoning with someone who might face civil liability. She was careful to emphasize that freezing assets did not mean seizing them immediately. It meant asking a court for temporary relief to preserve resources while a case was resolved. Legal terms she translated into plain English because she knew Patrick was not a lawyer and needed clarity more than technical precision.
At the same time as the legal architecture was being drafted, Patrick and Raymond pursued what investigators call open-source intelligence. They looked for patterns in Kayla's social feed, posts, comments, friend tags, and for any deleted material cached by web archives. On a grey morning, Raymond texted Patrick a time-stamped screen capture, a deleted Instagram story showing a pair of shoes at a restaurant table, posted weeks earlier, archived by a bot, and now available. The shoes matched a photograph later posted by Derek that same month. It was not a dramatic revelation in isolation, but as a piece in the mosaic it mattered. Alongside these electronic breadcrumbs were analog traces. A neighbor had recorded on a doorbell camera a late-night car idling in front of the house at 2:13 a.m. on a date in late July. The vehicle was dark in the footage, but the angle caught the rear quarter panel, and when Raymond enhanced the image, the first few digits of the plate became legible. The plate matched the registration Raymond had already tied to Derek Mawson. All of these were not convictions. They were, at minimum, coincidences that demanded explanation. Throughout these discoveries, Patrick kept reminding himself of a single principle that lawyers say often: evidence is not storytelling. Evidence is the raw material that allows a story to be told convincingly in court or in public. That distinction shaped every move.
When Patricia advised serving a demand letter first, a formal written demand outlining the evidence of false allegation and the remedies Patrick would seek, she was looking to force a reaction without immediately tearing open the family in a courtroom. Demand letters can bring settlements or forced admissions. They can also prod the other side into a defensive posture. It was a measured move, and it suited Patrick's growing preference for control over spectacle. But control has limits. The family, once stained by allegation and then by counter-evidence, moved unpredictably. Angelina did not answer calls from Patrick. Kayla, according to a recovered screenshot of a social app status, appeared to oscillate between outrage and vulnerability in direct messages to friends. Derek, when contacted through his listed company line, was terse and denied any impropriety. He claimed to be a married man with a family, and his wife, Amanda Morrison, appeared later on social media in an image that suggested normalcy: holiday parties, school runs. That image complicated the public perception of the situation. Families are not monoliths. They are made of people with claims and social stake. Patrick found the social dynamics almost as exhausting as the investigative grind. People who had once been cordial became suspicious. Local reporters sniffed rumor. A community gossip column printed a story with anonymous sources asserting that the wedding cake of the family night was ruined. An innocuous claim spun into an emblem of immorality. Patricia cautioned restraint. "You are not going to win public hearts by fighting fire with fire," she told him. "You will win by compiling what the court and the evidence will accept." Still, the human impulse to right or wrong by telling everyone who had believed the wrong burned bright. Patrick wanted not just his house back, but to unring the bell of public shame. He wanted a retraction, an apology, an acknowledgement that those at the table had witnessed an untrue statement. But law is not theater. Sometimes it trades immediate satisfaction for strategic advantage. As the early winter months rolled in, Patrick's life narrowed to an alternating rhythm of legal meetings and solitary inventorying. He would meet Patricia in a small conference room where she would explain the next document to be sought, and then he would return to the motel or a friend's spare room to scan receipts and catalog messages. Raymond, who conducted stakeouts with the patient persistence of a man who had watched careers crumble, called it odd hours with small discoveries: a parking ticket, a suspicious delivery log, a name that appeared in a chain of text messages. One of those small discoveries felt for a moment like a turning point. Raymond had recovered a grainy clip from a neighbor's security camera that showed a late-night figure approaching the side door of Patrick's house on the sort of night when only people who had a key or knew the code would be expected. The figure's headlamp cut through fog, and then the camera caught the tail light of an unfamiliar car pulling away. The plate was traceable, and trace led to Derek Morrison. Patrick stared at the image for a long time in his lawyer's office, the grainy pixels a poor substitute for the complex human truth behind them. At this stage, with metadata and some footage and firm alibi records in his pocket, Patrick and his legal team readied themselves for the more formal phase of litigation. That meant drafting subpoenas and preparing to demand medical records that could establish clinically a conception window. It meant looking for a medical opinion that could, by gestational dating, place conception outside the time Kayla alleged. It meant talking strategy about when to take the fight public and when to keep deposits of information private until they were ready to make a decisive move. Patricia explained in careful, quiet terms what a subpoena would do in practice.
A subpoena can make a phone company, a hospital, and a social platform produce documents and records, she said. It must be issued in a legally defensible way and backed by a credible claim that we have to establish. In plain language, a subpoena is a tool to force the hand of repositories of information. It doesn't create evidence, it makes otherwise inaccessible documents available to the court. The team agreed on a phased approach: secure the travel and financial records, then the phone metadata, then the CCTV and delivery logs, and finally medical records that would speak directly to gestational timing. Drafting subpoenas and motions is tedious work, the sort of legal craftsmanship that plays poorly in dramatic retellings, but which, in reality, is decisive. Each request had to be narrowly tailored to survive objections. Each clause had to anticipate the likely pushback. When Patricia would say, "We need to avoid any claim of overreach," she meant not only that the court might throw out a broadly worded subpoena, but that the defensive optics could be damaging. The law requires precision as a practical and ethical safeguard. By the time they were ready to file, Patrick had amassed a compact but compelling bundle of material: the Seattle travel receipts for 14 to 17 September, time-stamped photographs, a company expense report, a motel folio for the night he had first fled his house, and a dossier of call log metadata showing repeated late-night contacts between Kayla and Derek. These items taken together formed an argument. The allegation at the family table did not comport with readily verifiable facts about Patrick's whereabouts. That did not in itself prove bad faith by Kayla or Derek, but it did warrant the court's attention.
They filed the first documents. The process felt like releasing a breath held too long. The filings were conservative, requests for records, not immediate accusations. Patrick watched as the case began to ripen into something that might either vindicate him or explode their family further. He understood the stakes. The legal route could heal, or it could hurt more, depending on what the evidence showed and how the public consumed it. Late one evening, as snow began to melt into a slushy drizzle outside, Raymond knocked on his motel door with a new file. It contained a transcript of a voicemail, one she had left on a mutual friend's phone, now cached, and a screenshot of a message Kayla had sent to a third party saying, "I can't keep this secret any longer." In isolation, those messages were ambiguous, but in the aggregate, they began to shape a narrative of someone who had mobilized a public accusation, and one or more people who might have had reason to cooperate or encourage that course. Patrick read until the room blurred. He allowed himself a small, bitter satisfaction. He had not been paralyzed by accusation. He had, instead, used the accusation to reveal a different story. There would be more to come. The law would move at its slow, deliberate pace. The public would move faster. Family would move in a messier arc between the two. And none of it would bring back the calm they had the night before the vow renewal. The point at which they had to decide whether to make their findings public or to pursue a private settlement was approaching. They had by then a preliminary dossier that could be presented in court: an alibi for Patrick, metadata linking Kayla to Derek, a plate trace putting Derek's vehicle at the house, and a trail of social media posts that suggested overlap. But even with this evidence, the team's strategy remained cautious. Patricia warned that making the case public too soon might galvanize the other side to destroy evidence or to mount a legal counterattack aimed at discrediting him emotionally rather than narrowly in the documents. So they prepared subpoenas. They drafted a demand letter outlining the evidence and the remedies sought: restoration of the house, a public apology, and monetary compensation for the damages down to Patrick's livelihood and reputation. They also prepared for the possibility that Derek or Kayla would respond with legal maneuvers of their own. The threat of a countersuit for defamation was a real risk in such cases, even if the original accusation was public. The legal game was not just about proving a point, it was about preserving options and avoiding self-inflicted wounds. On a late afternoon in December, with the first subpoena served and the first formal responses trickling back, Patrick sat in a neutral room with Patricia and Raymond and said something small and honest: "I don't want to ruin anyone. I want the truth to be out." It was not the same as forgiveness. It was a statement about priority. He wanted the truth because it would allow him to reclaim his life. It would let him sleep in his own bed again. It would, he hoped, make the future possible. The case at this stage had only begun to reveal the outlines of an arrangement that, if it were what the evidence suggested, involved blurred lines between professional and private relationships and decisions taken by adults that had the capacity to wound multiple people. Nobody in Patrick's circle, least of all him, wanted to bring ruin down on children or spouses who might suffer collateral harm. That restraint shaped how Patricia crafted letters and how Raymond surveilled evidence. Discreet, methodical, mindful of human cost. They were, at the close of these early months, standing on a threshold. There were more documents to come, more medical records to request, and crucially, a question about timing. When to make the evidence public, if at all. Each of those moves would ripple. Patrick knew that once certain records were lawfully exposed, medical notes for instance, there would be no going back on the personal dimensions of the story. He also knew the stakes were not merely legal. In his quiet moments, he contemplated what had been lost, the casual Sunday breakfasts, the small pleasures of shared silence that become the scaffolding of a life. He did not want to be defined by the accusation forever. He wanted to be defined by what happened next, whether he would pick up the scattered pieces and rebuild, and how he would do it without becoming the kind of person he despised, vindictive, bitter, irretrievably changed. At the end of this phase, when subpoenas were sent, when a plate number and a handful of call logs suggested an alternate father, when the motel receipts and flight manifests gave him an alibi, Patrick experienced a strange quiet. It was not peace, it was a readiness. The tools were gathered: counsel, investigator, evidence. What remained was the tougher part, the legal and moral choreography that would determine whether a public apology could be extracted, whether property could be returned, and whether the damage could be repaired without a courtroom spectacle. They paused then, not because nothing else could be done, but because the next steps required patience. The law takes time, and so did Patrick's desire for a resolution that would restore not just his house and career, but something more elusive: trust in the world. They waited. It was a strange, brittle kind of waiting, an interval full of small, precise actions that felt, in their ordinariness, like progress. Patrick logged receipts into spreadsheets, scanned documents into a secure cloud folder Patricia recommended, and read legal memos until legal terms stopped sounding foreign. Raymond ran his circuits of the neighborhood and emailed grainy stills at dawn. Patricia drafted subpoenas and motions with an economy that made their meaning feel inevitable rather than theatrical.
Then the first subpoena returns arrived. It began, predictably, with a carrier's production, call detail records showing the timestamps of calls and texts for the numbers in question. The carrier produced months of logs in response to the court order, precisely the kind of metadata Patrick had been poring over on his own, but now authenticated by subpoena, which matters in court. A provider's records are admissible as company documents and harder to discredit as manipulated screenshots. The logs confirmed the pattern Raymond had suspected: frequent, sometimes daily, contact between Kayla's phone and a number that resolved to Derek Morrison. A second tranche of documents came from the hotel chain. They produced a folio for an unremarkable room in late July, with a credit card imprint that, when Patricia ran the merchant codes, matched a transaction attached to Derek's corporate card. A forensic accountant on Patricia's team cross-referenced the folio against a sequence of Instagram posts that had been archived by web-scraping bots. One image had been taken in a downtown bistro late in July. Another was a cropped shot of a motel keycard in a breakfast tray. Individually, none of these items would have anything like the final force they took on together. Stacked, they made a pattern. The most decisive production came, however, from the medical records request. Patricia had been careful. Medical records are intensely private, intensely regulated. To obtain them, you must show a legitimate legal basis and comply with strict privacy protections. It required a targeted subpoena to the clinic that had handled Kayla's prenatal care. The clinic responded, under court order, with an ultrasound report and prenatal notes authored by a Dr. Hammond. Dr. Hammond's summary was clinical and precise. The ultrasound, taken at a first trimester appointment, included measurements of the embryo's crown rump length and an estimated gestational age. The report included an estimated conception window anchored to a specific date, 28 July 2024, with a normal margin of error, the doctor explained in the chart. It was the kind of language clinicians use, not dramatic, not accusatory, only exact. For Patrick, it was seismic. If the gestational dating was correct, the alleged conception window claimed at the November dinner could not include a mid-September encounter as the initiating moment. The dates did not align. It is worth pausing to explain why gestational dating matters and why doctors' estimates carry weight. In early pregnancy, ultrasound measurements of the embryo provide a reliable estimation of gestational age because growth in the first trimester is remarkably uniform. A clinician measures the embryo and, using established charts, can estimate when conception most likely occurred. It is not infallible. The margin of error widens the further one gets from conception, but it is a medically accepted method to establish timing.
In a civil dispute where timing is material, such a report is powerful evidence.
Patricia laid the printout on the conference table with a calm that no one could mistake for detachment. "This is not proof in isolation," she said, "but it provides a medically supported time frame that contradicts the timeline made public at the dinner. It complements the alibi and the metadata. It strengthens our cause." When she said it, a small, practical ripple of relief passed through Patrick. Relief, and also dread. Evidence that exonerated him in the narrow legal sense also widened the circle of disclosure. It meant personal medical information was now legally part of the file. Legal vindication came at the cost of privacy. The next weeks moved in compressed, frenetic bursts. Raymond kept turning up small but telling items. A receipt for a late-night sushi order charged to Derek's card and delivered to a hotel near the city center on 26 July. A parking ticket issued under Derek's name on 27 July in the neighborhood near Patrick's home. An enhanced clip from a neighbor's CCTV showing a car with a partial plate pulling up outside Patrick's house on 28 July just after midnight. Every new item was treated like a tile in a mosaic. Alone, ambiguous. Together, a picture. Then came the social media recovery Raymond had been hunting for. Accounts are often curated and trimmed. Posts disappear. But web archives and cached copies live in corners most users never see. Raymond located an Instagram post that had been deleted, a photograph of a pair of shoes under a table with a caption that, in context, suggested a late July meal. It had been posted from a location consistent with the restaurant that Derek's credit card receipt identified. Raymond produced a side-by-side comparison of the shoot image and a later photo Derek had posted from an unrelated brunch. The shoes matched. In court, these are small details, almost petty. In an evidentiary narrative, they accumulate into plausibility. There were also the accounts of friends and low-level drama that often surround affairs. A text message stored on an archivist service where a mutual friend had ripped a screenshot, and days later Kayla had sent a message saying she was scared and needed someone to stand with her. These messages do not, again, prove more than what they are. Assertions, fears, confessions of anxiety. But they did pattern with the chronological sequence that the medical record suggested. They showed a period of interaction and intimacy that aligned with the conception window in late July. The legal strategy broadened. Patricia filed a motion to preserve evidence and an emergency application for an asset freeze against Derek in the civil calendar. An asset freeze is a court order that prevents a party from moving or hiding assets while litigation is ongoing. It is a protective measure. Think of it as legally asking the court to lock the doors to a safer neutral condition while the dispute is resolved.
Patricia's motion outlined a risk. If Derek were to be found liable in a civil action, there was a danger he might transfer or dissipate funds to avoid paying a judgment. The freeze would be temporary and would only last while the court determined the merits of the claim, but it sent a clear message. The legal machinery had teeth. Filing a motion for a freeze is not a step to be taken lightly. Courts require credible evidence that there is a real risk of asset dissipation. Patricia therefore bolstered the motion with financial records and plausible explanations tied to Derek's managerial position and liquidity. The motion also requested expedited discovery on Derek's corporate expenses to look for any overlap with the hotel folio and food receipts. The judge, after a short hearing, agreed to a limited preservation order, enough to make the other side take notice. At the same time, the team prepared for depositions. A deposition, simply put, is an out-of-court sworn testimony where a witness answers questions under oath. The answers can be used later in court and are designed to pin down positions, flush out inconsistencies, and give lawyers a clearer view of the adversary's case. Depositions are both tedious and revealing. People who lie in depositions risk perjury charges. People who are truthful produce documents that later corroborate their statements. The prospect of giving sworn testimony can either prompt settlement or sharpen defense lines. Patrick faced his own deposition in mid-January. Sitting across from a bank of lawyers in a glassed conference room, he recounted the night at the vow renewal, the days that followed, the motel room, and the flight receipts. He felt small and exposed in a way that being publicly accused had never managed to convey. To detail the minutiae of his life under oath was to make the private procedural. Still, the deposition went smoothly. When opposing counsel attempted to challenge his memory about certain times, Patricia's precise documents, boarding confirmations, timestamps on photos, laid down his version with the quiet force of records. Depositions for Kayla and Derek were scheduled in turn. They arrived with counsel and a posture that varied between composure and thinly veiled agitation. Derek, who once seemed implacable on social media, appeared less comfortable when faced with the possibility of sworn testimony about his presence in July. Kayla, when deposed, offered testimony that had emotional undertones. She spoke about confusion, trauma, and the moment she decided she needed to speak publicly. Depositions are not trials, they're slices of a larger process.
but they reveal the contours of what opposing counsel will be willing to accept and where their vulnerabilities might lie. Meanwhile, the story had escaped the insulating shell of the court file and entered the public arena. Local outlets, initially tentative and anonymous, began to run the headlines. Some called it a family scandal.
Others, more conservatively, wrote about conflicting claims, centered on a man's claim of innocence backed by travel receipts and medical records. The framing mattered, and Patricia had been careful in the timing of releases. You do not want to give a tabloid a sensational nugget that destroys the possibility of a dignified settlement. But the public would not be kept waiting indefinitely. Someone would tell the story if the parties did not. Derek's lawyers began to make calls. Negotiation, as Patricia explained to Patrick, is often about momentum and leverage. When the balance of admissible evidence shifted to a place where Derek's potential exposure increased, leverage moved from one side to another. That change encourages talks. Derek's counsel proposed an off-the-record meeting to see if the matter can be resolved without protracted litigation. In plain terms, settlement. That phrase, without protracted litigation, can mean many things. For Patrick, it meant relief from an open, public jousting match he neither wanted nor had the appetite to sustain. For Derek, it could mean an agreement that settled civil liabilities short of an admission of wrongdoing. For Kayla, it could mean a structured path to make amends without further public pillory. For counsel on both sides, it meant negotiating language, amounts, and the precise contours of admissions and apologies. Negotiations opened slowly and with posturing. Patricia and the opposing counsel traded offers through their assistants. Raymond provided further corroboration, new CCTV stills, receipt timelines, to increase the pressure. At one point, Patrick asked Patricia directly if settlement would require Derek to admit paternity. Admissions are tricky, she replied. You can often negotiate wording that achieves functional results, acknowledgement, participation in paternity testing, a public statement, without the defendant admitting legal liability. But we will demand a clear, enforceable resolution that returns your home and secures an apology. There was also the practical calculus of time and psychological cost. Litigation can be an elastic, draining process. Even if you have the stronger evidence, you must consider whether the time, money, and public scrutiny required to push every claim to a jury are worth it. Many plaintiffs accept a settlement that restores P material losses and secures a public statement because the intangible costs of an extended trial can outweigh the benefits. As the offers surfaced, one critical tidbit changed the dynamic. A local investigative reporter, quietly tiptoeing through public submissions, contacted Patricia with an offer to run a story based on court filings and authenticated subpoenaed documents. The reporters stressed accuracy because they knew the liability stakes.
Patricia's firm had been cultivating a disciplined drip strategy. Release a set of carefully crafted, court-substantiated documents, let the public see the evidence, and create the reputational environment that favors a principled settlement rather than a he-said, she-said spectacle. After consulting with Patrick, Patricia authorized a limited release that summarized the medical finding, the timeline of Patrick's travel, and the metadata confirming contact between Kayla and Derek. The story hit the local site with the headline phrased to avoid defamation. Man's travel records, medical reports raise questions after family accusation, and immediately the pressure on Derek's camp increased. The phone call from Derek's counsel arrived the next morning like a small capitulation. They wanted to negotiate in good faith. An initial offer had been tabled, a financial settlement in exchange for an agreement that would include a public apology from Kayla, a notarized statement from Derek acknowledging biological parentage, financial support as agreed, and the return of the house to Patrick's name. There were also proposed confidentiality provisions, standard in settlements, meant to keep details private. Patrick bristled at the idea of a full confidentiality clause. He wanted the public apology to be seen. Patricia countered, suggesting the apology be recorded and widely distributed while other financial terms remain confidential. One negotiation fallacy states that settlement is simply about money. In truth, settlements are about control. The control to shape the narrative, to secure remedies without the unpredictability of trial, and to create enforceable obligations that prevent future harm. For Patrick, control meant sleeping in his house again, seeing his name cleared in public, and having legal guarantors to prevent future false claims. For Derek's side, control meant avoiding a jury trial and the attendant reputational damage of an open court where medical records and phone logs would be publicly debated. After days of tokens and countermoves, a tentative agreement was sketched. The headline elements were familiar to those who had watched the case unfold. The house title would be transferred back to Patrick. Derek would sign and notarize a paternity acknowledgement and agree to the financial terms outlined in the settlement. Kayla would record and publish a public apology, distributed through the same local channels that had first carried the story, and certain criminal charges would be kept in reserve, not pursued immediately if any terms were breached. Kept in reserve is legal parlance for preserving the right to bring criminal charges in the future should the settlement be violated, or if new criminal facts emerged. It is not a pledge to prosecute, only a retention of legal options. There were also provisions intended to protect the collateral victims, Amanda Morrison and any children, should they be impacted by the public disclosures.
Patricia insisted on language that would avoid unnecessary intrusions into their private lives and limited the scope of any public statement to the parties directly involved. Settlement is rarely tidy in human terms. It is compromise in technical form. The moral calculus, justice versus restoration, was negotiated clause by clause. Dramatization, a negotiation scene reconstructed from depositions and correspondence. Patrick sat in a conference room with Patricia, listening as opposing counsel read a draft clause aloud. If the paternity acknowledgement is later shown to be materially inaccurate, the parties shall. The clause trailed into legalese about rescission and remedy. Patrick signed where Patricia advised him to sign. He felt in that moment not triumphant, but relieved. To have a document that returned his house, that required an apology and a public correction, felt like the quiet, practical satisfaction of a life no longer suspended. When the settlement terms were finalized and signed, they were not a courtroom drama with gavel strikes and singing choirs. They were a stack of notarized pages and a set of bank transfers and a short, carefully worded apology video recorded by Kayla. The apology contained words Patrick had asked for, an expression of regret for what she had done, an admission that her earlier public assertion had harmed him, and a promise to seek counseling. Derek's paternity acknowledgement was notarized and lodged with the relevant registry. Financial payments were arranged through an escrow mechanism with verification steps. The house deed transfer took a week of administrative machinery and a cleared check. Settlement was not the same as vindication in the court of public feeling. It did, however, produce practical restoration. Patrick was allowed back into the house. The locks were changed again, this time with him present, and the mattress from the motel went to charity. At work, Gerald had not fired him. In a small meeting in March, after the settlement had become a matter of public record, Gerald offered Patrick his old rollback and an unexpected promotion in recognition of his diligence and the way he had handled a crisis without letting it affect his work. The promotion came with a caveat. There were questions from some colleagues, and the return to normalcy was punctuated by awkward silence at the coffee station. Restoration is rarely instantaneous. The media coverage was inevitable. Some outlets cheered the outcome as a vindication. Others wrote about the enduring scars. Derek's reputation suffered in the community. Amanda and her children retreated from social media. Patricia had insisted that the settlement avoid gratuitous humiliation of family members and recommended the apology be measured and focused on Patrick. She knew, too, that public exposure had human cost. People, she told Patrick, often underappreciate the collateral harm of public controversy to the children and spouses of those involved.
There were legal clauses that matter to understand, because in this sort of settlement, the language determines future options. Derek's paternity acknowledgement was legally enforceable as a civil recognition of parentage. The settlement contained liquidated damages provisions, predetermined sums to be paid if any party breached the textual commitments, such as failing to publish the apology or attempting to transfer assets to avoid payment. The asset freeze motion had already accomplished part of its work. It slowed any rapid movement of Derek's funds and signaled to his counsel that the court would not tolerate reckless dissipation. Patrick kept one demand, that criminal charges remain an option if the settlement terms were intentionally violated or if evidence of criminal falsity emerged. The district attorney's office had been notified by Patricia earlier in the process and had indicated they would review the file if material suggested criminal conduct. In the settlement, the parties agreed to hold criminal matters in abeyance, again, not an abandonment but a preservation of rights. When the apology video aired, Patrick watched it once in the living room where they had once shared Saturday pancakes. Kayla spoke haltingly at first, then more clearly. "I made an accusation at my family's celebration that harmed Patrick," she said. "I am sorry for the pain I caused." The words were fewer than Patrick had imagined he would need, and yet they sat with him like a tangible object, a small token of restitution. Public apologies are imperfect instruments. They cannot undo the first moment, but they are part of the civil economy of repair. A curious and difficult grief remained. People pick up their lives and scaffold them with practicalities, home routines, mortgages, work, but the social geography of family had shifted. Some relatives stayed close, others kept their distance. Angelina did not reconcile with Patrick in any meaningful public way. The marital dissolution, for all the settlement's closure, remained an open personal matter.
The settlement solved many legal problems, but did not automatically repair emotional bonds. There were also, inevitably, questions in Patrick's mind about motive and why the accusation had been made in the first place. Evidence suggested coordination and a financial dimension, messages showing Kayla's outreach to Derek, and certain transactions that hinted at pre-existing patterns. But motive, Patricia explained, is messy and often multi-layered. Financial considerations may have been part of it. Emotional turmoil and personal narratives certainly fed into the public spectacle. The law can address harm in discrete ways. It cannot, by itself, fully illuminate the private motives that prompt people to act. The aftermath required rebuilding in small, concrete ways. Patrick returned to work, and to his surprise, found that the sense of being tested had matured him in some colleagues' eyes.
The promotion came with responsibility and a recognition that he had handled a personal crisis while maintaining professional standards. He set about making the house his again, changing pictures on the wall, finding a new rhythm for coffee and laundry, beginning to imagine a life unshadowed by the accusation. He took a small course in mediation at the Civic College because he found the idea of helping others navigate conflict restorative. Emotionally, he sought therapy. The therapist, Sarah, who specialized in trauma related to public shaming, helped him articulate the residual anxieties about trusting shared spaces and the intrusive feeling of being watched. Therapy did not erase the memory of the vow renewal dinner or the sound of forks falling, but it offered tools to recognize triggers and to rebuild a sense of internal safety. He practiced small rituals, an early morning run past the river, a quiet meal at a cafe where no one knew his history. The rituals were small, ordinary acts of reclamation. There were still practical fences to mend. Patrick had to repair his credit after the short-term financial consequences of being on leave. He negotiated with insurers over coverage for legal costs. He sat with lawyers to decide whether to retain the option to file for punitive damages if new evidence suggested egregious conduct. These were less narrative-friendly tasks, but they are the scalpeling of real life after public humiliation. Patrick also became, reluctantly, an object lesson. At community talks and in private conversations, he began to explain what he had learned about preserving evidence, keep travel records, screenshot suspicious posts, maintain separate email archives. He did not offer legal advice. Patricia had cautioned him to avoid that, but he shared what he knew as practical survival tools. People who had once admired his quiet competence now asked him about metadata and subpoenas. He found the role odd, a man who had been a victim now offering hard-earned tips on prevention. There was a moral calculus to his choice not to pursue immediate criminal prosecutions. Patrick could have pressed prosecutors to file charges. Instead, he chose a path prioritizing restoration and control. That decision was controversial among some friends and observers who wanted a more retributive outcome. But Patrick had watched the legal process and felt comfortable that a civil settlement would deliver the principal goals he needed: a return of his property, an acknowledged correction of the public record, and enforceable financial remedies. He kept the criminal option available should new facts emerge. Holding the option in reserve meant he had not foregone justice, so much as chosen the instrument best suited to immediate restoration. A year after the vow renewal dinner, Patrick stood in his garden planting a sapling he had bought the weekend before. The house around him had a patched window and a new welcome mat.
Children in the cul-de-sac practiced bicycle tricks. He had friends who invited him to dinners again. The accident of notoriety had faded into the background of everyday life. That slow dimming was not a nullification of the injury he had suffered. It was a testament to human resilience and legal remedy woven together. In interviews after the settlement, Patrick struggled with a particular recurring question: would he have done anything differently? He thought for a long while that the answer would be complicated by regret over what had been said at the table and what had been done in response. In the end, he settled on a narrower truth. He wished he had backed up more things sooner: texts, receipts, casual photos. He wished, too, that he'd had a clearer plan for how to control social narrative in the first weeks after accusation. These are small, practical regrets, rather than grand moral failings. They are the things that keep you watchful rather than bitter. There remained an unsettled pity for Kayla and for others whose lives had been reshaped by the months-long legal entropy. Kayla's public apology, the counseling clause in the settlement, and the financial arrangements did not erase her pain or the complex personal reasons she had for making a public claim. Patrick, in being human, felt compassion mixed with justified anger. The settlement offered him an opportunity to move on. He took it without pretending the wound had fully healed. There were technical aftershocks too. Raymond Dahr's careful archive of evidence sat in a secure digital vault, available should the need to enforce the settlement arise. Patricia notified the court when payments were made and filed the necessary releases when the house deed changed hands. The lawyer's work, bureaucratic and precise,
closed the loop on the more tangible end of the story. For viewers who watch from a distance, the narrative may seem tidy: accusation, investigation, proof, settlement, restoration. But the lived texture of the year that followed was less theatrical and more textured by small decisions. Patrick rebuilt his life with incremental, careful acts, returning to the company cafeteria, reintroducing himself to neighbors, learning how to hold both grievance and empathy. He found ways to sleep through the night more often and to be present at birthday parties again without scanning for cameras. One of the more unexpected outcomes was the way the ordeal changed his relationship to certainty. He realized how fragile reputation is, how quickly social capital can be eroded by a single public claim, and how stubbornly the record of truth must be defended by documents and careful legal work. At the same time, he developed a humility about motive and narrative. People are seldom one-dimensional, and public statements rarely capture the full human context. In a modest but meaningful symbolic moment, Patrick invited a handful of friends who had stood by him to the garden in late spring.
There was cake, and the sapling's trunk was tied with a ribbon. He read them the brief clause from the settlement that had returned the house to his name. They cheered softly. It was small and entirely human. Years later, when the story came up in a conversation, Patrick would explain that the settlement had been less about revenge than about reclaiming control. He would emphasize the role of evidence, flight manifests, medical reports, phone metadata, and how modern life leaves an increasingly precise trail for those willing to follow it. He would warn people to preserve records and to be clear-eyed about the costs of litigating reputation. He would also, sometimes, speak about the moral choice to pursue redress in a manner that prioritized restoration over public spectacle. The legal terms allowed him to retain options. The ability to bring criminal charges if necessary remained in the background, a technical possibility rather than an active strategy. Derek's public paternity acknowledgement and Kayla's apology were part of the settlement. The documents were filed, notarized, and recorded, the financial terms executed through escrow. The house was no longer a place he was barred from entering. It was his again. The re-established normal was not the naive ordinary of years before, but it was serviceable and, importantly, safe. As a final act of reconstruction, Patrick set out to create a small handbook for friends and colleagues, a plain language primer on collecting and preserving evidence, protecting privacy when litigation is possible, and understanding the difference between civil remedies and criminal prosecution. It's not legal advice, Patricia had insisted on that, but a layperson's guide to surviving an unfair public accusation. He gave copies to friends and to a local community center that ran seminars on digital safety. If there is a moral to be pulled from this story, it is not triumphalist. It is not the comfortable ending of cinematic revenge. It is instead an argument for method over rage, for assembling facts rather than amplifying fury, for choosing a pathway that prioritizes durable remedies over immediate satisfaction. Patrick found vindication in the alignment of documents and testimony, and in the quiet legal remedies that restored his home and corrected the public record. He found restoration not by destroying those who had hurt him, but by insisting on the truth and letting the legal process do its work. A last image, Patrick folding up the apology video he had kept, a short, imperfect recording that Kayla had made. He kept it not as a trophy, but as evidence that the public record had been corrected. He watched it with a kind of weary acceptance. Those words, legally protected and publicly distributed, had helped him rebuild a life, and in doing so taught him how fragile and how recoverable reputation can be. What would he advise someone in the same situation? Preserve everything. Seek counsel quickly.
Let evidence, not emotion, determine your moves. Understand that legal remedies exist for restoration, but they demand patience and a certain moral clarity about what you truly want. Punishment, apology, restitution, or all of the above in measured proportions. If you were in Patrick's shoes, what would you do first? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Then subscribe to follow more stories about truth, evidence, and the human cost of a single public claim.